All right, let's get right into it. We're diving into a really fascinating and honestly pretty intense debate happening in Japan. And it all centers around one big question. Should the law that requires schools to teach about LGBT issues actually be changed? You know, this isn't just a simple policy debate. It's a clash of deeply held values, and you'll see that both sides have some really powerful arguments.
So what's this whole thing really about? Well, when you strip everything else away, it boils down to this one central question: idealism or reality? In other words, should we be driven by this beautiful, high-minded goal of inclusion for everyone, or should our laws be based on the practical, sometimes messy reality of actually making things work on the ground? That's the real tension here, and that's what we're going to unpack.
Okay, so to really get this, we need to zoom in on the specific piece of law that's causing all the fuss. It's called Article 11 of the LGBT Understanding Promotion Act. And what it does is it legally requires the state and local governments to promote understanding of sexual diversity right there in schools. This one article, this single provision, is the spark that lit this entire fire.
All right, let's start with the first side in this debate. We'll call them the affirmative side. Their stance is pretty straightforward. They believe that Article 11, the part about education in schools, should be completely removed from the law. So why do they think that? Let's dig into their arguments.
So their case is built on three main points. First off, they're really concerned about child development. They argue that if you start teaching really complex ideas like gender identity to young kids, when their own sense of self is still forming, it could just lead to a lot of confusion and anxiety. That's point one. Second, it's about the family. They believe this law steps on the rights of parents to decide how and when to talk to their own kids about these kinds of sensitive subjects. And third, and this is a big one, they look at the teachers and say, hey, they're just not ready. They don't have the training or the expertise to teach this stuff correctly, and that could end up causing more problems than it solves.
And this quote, this really sums up their entire perspective. They make it very clear. They say, look, this is not about tolerating discrimination. What they're trying to do, in their view, is offer a more practical, a more sustainable way to build understanding, one that crucially respects the development of children and the rights of families to guide that development.
Okay, so that's the argument for changing the law. Now, what about the other side? This is the negative side, and they argue just as passionately that, no, we need to keep this education article right where it is.
And their counterargument also has three main pillars. First, they push back on the idea that this is too complex for kids. They say, hey, we're not trying to teach graduate-level gender theory here. The goal is much simpler. Teach kids to respect that people are different. That's a basic social skill. Second, they bring up human rights. Their view is that a child's right to live free from discrimination is fundamental, and that right should come before any family values that might teach prejudice. And finally, they see this law as a compass. It points the way forward, and more importantly, it forces the government to finally get serious about providing the right training for teachers. And this quote, wow. It really captures the urgency and the core fear on their side. For them, getting rid of this article isn't just some small tweak to the law. They see it as actively robbing children of the knowledge and empathy they're going to need in a diverse world. And worse, they believe it would just let discrimination and prejudice continue to grow.
All right, so we've laid out both positions. Now for the interesting part. Let's see exactly where these two arguments collide, because this is where you really see what the fight is all about.
Okay, first up, child development. The affirmative side is basically saying, whoa, slow down. This is too complex, it could confuse kids. But the negative side comes right back and says, what are you talking about? It's not complex at all. We're just teaching a simple basic skill. Respect people, even if they're different. So a total disagreement on what's actually being taught.
Next, let's look at parental rights. This one is a classic conflict. The affirmative side puts the family first. They say parents have a legally protected right to teach their kids their own values. But the negative side says, not so fast. They argue that a child's basic human right to be safe from discrimination has to take priority over any family value that could be harmful.
And what about the teachers? This is fascinating because both sides agree there's a problem, teachers aren't prepared, but they see it from completely opposite angles. The affirmative side looks at the lack of training and says, this is dangerous, we have to stop the law now. The negative side looks at the same problem and says, see, that's why we need the law. It's the only way to force the system to create the training. So removing it would just kill any chance of progress.
So, there you have it. Two really compelling arguments, both logical, both passionate. You can see why this is such a tough issue. After hearing all of that, the judges had to make a decision. So, who do you think won?
In the end, the victory went to the affirmative side. The judges sided with the argument to remove the education article from the law.
So the big question is, why? What was the deciding factor? Well, the judges' reasoning is super insightful. They said the affirmative side won because their arguments were just more grounded. They were rooted in realistic, practical problems that you can see and feel, things like the lack of training and the potential confusion for kids. That argument about the practical harm an ideal's first law could cause was just more consistent and powerful in the end.
But, this whole thing is about more than just who won or lost a formal debate. It really shines a light on a core tension that we see in so many social issues all over the world.
What it really highlights is that fundamental conflict we talked about at the very beginning. It's the struggle between a beautiful, universal ideal, like human rights and inclusion, and the really messy, complicated, practical challenges you face when you try to actually implement that ideal in the real world, in real schools, with real families.
And so, that really leaves us with a huge question to think about, doesn't it? When our highest ideals, the things we strive for as a society, run head-on into the practical challenges of reality, how do we respond? Which one gives way? There's obviously no easy answer, but figuring that out is, well, it's pretty much what progress is all about.